Hi again, everyone. So this is our second video on pedigrees. So here we're going to work on a variety of inheritance patterns that have something to do with sex, that are linked to sex in some way. So we said that it's kind of brutal to reduce all of our humanity down to these boxes and circles, and that we know that there's a lot more diversity than we actually can represent here with our very simple diagram. So that raises the question of why do we care about sexes when we're studying strictly genetic traits? And we came up with three ideas for this. The first is that you have different inheritance. For some traits, you inherit different things from mom versus dad, and we'll talk about those. In addition, some traits are sex limited. So an example is male pattern baldness, where some males go bald as they or lose their hair as they age. And finally, we have imprinting. We'll cover this in the next video. This is the most exotic of them, but I think it's also really pretty cool. So here's a picture of the cell, and we discussed that proteins are throughout the cell. We have proteins all over the cell in all these different organelles. But by contrast, we only have genes in two places. We have genes in the nucleus, and we have genes in the mitochondrion. And we can extend that to plant cells. So in plant cells, there are actually three places with genes. The nucleus, can I find the nucleus here? The nucleus, the mitochondrion, and then the third place is the chloroplast. Okay, so with that prelude, let's talk about Kearns-Sayre syndrome. Kearns-Sayre syndrome is a disease of the eyes that leads to eventual paralysis of eye muscles with drooping eyelids, and culminating in degeneration of the retina. So here's a hypothetical pedigree for a family in which some individuals are affected with Kearns-Sayre. So go ahead and take a moment if you'd like to think through things and try to figure out what's going on here. Okay, so some of you will have noticed that there always seems to be this pattern where affected fathers don't seem to pass down the trait. This father did not pass down the trait. This father did not pass down the trait. And that mothers always seem to. So here's a mother, and all three of her individuals are affected. Here's another affected mother, and both of her of her offspring are affected. And again, this mother, both of her offspring are affected. So what's going on here? Well, it turns out that this is a mitochondrial inherited disorder, and this is showing the classic maternal inheritance pattern of a mitochondrial condition. So here's basically a diagram of how mitochondria are inherited. Both males and females have mitochondria. However, mitochondria is not passed down in the sperm, it's passed down through the egg. And so what that means is that this individual only inherited mitochondria from one side, that is from the egg, not from the sperm. So this individual, if this individual is affected, then that indicates that the affected mitochondrion came down from the sperm, and thus that we would expect the mother is affected. So if the offspring is affected, then we expect the mother will be affected. And it turns out that the converse is also true. If the mother is affected, well, that mother will have passed down her single mitochondrial haplotype in the egg, which will then have been inherited in the offspring. So an affected mother should have affected offspring, an affected offspring should have an affected mother. And then we talked about this sentence: the trait is inherited in a dominant mitochondrial pattern. We decided that was kind of weird. Dominance is something that we talk about in the case where we have two different alleles, two different genotypes in an organism. But in this case, we basically have one lineage of mitochondria, so dominance really doesn't play in. We only inherit mitochondria from one parent, so there's not a question of which of two inherited alleles will dominate. So why don't we go back and so that makes sense. This individual has one mitochondrion passed down to both of her offspring, and then her daughter has one mitochondrion passed down to her offspring, and then her daughter passes things down. By contrast, the males in our pedigree do not pass down their mitochondrion, and so, as expected, their offspring are not affected by the syndrome. Okay, so here's another pedigree. I'll give you a moment. Go ahead and pause it if you'd like to observe what's going on here. Okay, so the first thing we can probably notice here is that all individuals that are affected with hairy ears, so I say not really here, it turns out that it was thought for a long time that hairy ears were passed down in this way. It turns out it's not. So this is actually a very rare form of inheritance. I think it's really good for building skills, but it's actually not all that common. So in this case, we notice that all individuals that are affected are males. And the other thing that we can notice is that every individual that is affected has an affected father. So this individual has an affected father. This one does as well. It turns out that this is characteristic of Y-linked inheritance. And so let's go through how this works. So do you see something funny about this diagram? Well, notice that we have an affected female here. Most females do not carry Y chromosomes. So except for in the case of a mutant SRY gene or something like this, this actually doesn't make sense for a Y-linked trait. Okay, so now we have a son that is affected. So that means that son carries the one Y genotype, which must have been inherited through the sperm, and therefore must have been inherited through the father. And so affected sons should have affected fathers. And the same thing is also the case. An affected father must have passed down, if that father has a son, that son must have inherited the Y, and therefore we would expect the son to also be affected. Okay, so we have our Y-linked rules here. All fathers with a trait have sons that have that trait. All sons with a trait should have fathers that have the trait. Okay, so here's just a question I'd like to stimulate you with. Go ahead and pause it if you'd like to think about it. But Y inheritance and mitochondrial inheritance have similarities and dissimilarities, and thinking about them I think is very useful for really getting all this straight in our heads. So go ahead and pause if you'd like to think about that for a minute, and then we're going to move on to the next topic. Okay, so here's another pedigree. This is for blue ornamental feathers in a bird. And go ahead and pause it if you'd like to think about this for a moment. So the first thing that we can notice about this is that it's only found in males, as with Y-linked inheritance. But it's not always the case that males have affected fathers. This one does. Well, this pedigree could be improved upon. It needn't be the case that males have affected fathers, though in this case, actually, both of our affected males where we know the father, or 2 out of 3, this one does have an affected father, this one does have an affected father. So actually that could be a little improved upon. That's a little bit misleading. With traits like this, as we'll discuss, it's not usually the case that affected males have affected fathers, but it's still the case here that we see that it's always males that are affected. Well, here's perhaps a more famous example of this. So this is actually my father here in the front and his 7 brothers. And what you can notice is they all look very similar, except for that some of them have no hair on top of their heads in classic male pattern baldness, and then others, all the way into their 70s and 80s, have very full heads of hair. So it turns out that male pattern baldness is, as with this trait, is a somewhat complicated phenomenon. So what it is it's a sex-limited X-linked trait. So let's break that down. So X-linked means that the gene that's responsible is on the X chromosome, but sex-limited means that the trait is only expressed, it's only observed in males. So that means that females could carry 2 X-linked, they could carry 2 X chromosomes that predispose to this trait, such that their sons would all have male pattern baldness, but they will not exhibit male pattern baldness. Okay, so let's start that out, and the first thing you can notice is that, again, doesn't make any sense if we're talking about a male sex-limited trait to have a female carrying the trait. So let's go to a male. And so let's think about what this means. So this means that this male has an affected X. Let's use X star to indicate that. So that individual, that male, must have inherited that X from his mother because the Y came from his father. And so that we know something about the mother's genotype. Well, what about her phenotype? So is the mother going to express this phenotype? Well, no, because we've said this is a sex-limited trait, a trait that's only expressed, in this case, in males. So the mother is not expected to express this trait. Okay, so what this means is that it's kind of hard to look at a pedigree and figure out, oh, that must be an X-linked recessive, because you actually don't see the transmission, right? The crucial gene here on the X chromosome is not being inherited from the father. It's being inherited from the mother, who does not show the phenotype. So in fact, it must be the case that all affected or that affected individuals typically do not have an affected parent. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a test for green-red color blindness. So I'm able to see the number here, but some of you may not. And often in college courses, some people learn that they have color blindness that they hadn't known before. So maybe some of you right now are saying, what? I don't see anything. But it turns out that those of us who do not have green-red color blindness can see here that there is an 8. And I'll trace it out in case some of you can't see it. That is an 8. So here's a pedigree, a typical pedigree for red-green color blindness. And so go ahead and take a moment to think about it, to make some observations about it. Go ahead and pause. All right, so now we're going to continue on with it. So the first thing you'll notice is that almost all of the individuals that are affected are males. Right? In this case, 5 out of 6 individuals in our pedigree are males. So it's similar to X-linked sex-limited traits, except for it's not entirely sex-limited because there's one female here, and yet it's not 50-50. So yes, in fact, X-linked green-blue color blindness, sorry, let's just say red-green color blindness is more common in males. So it's about 1% of the population in many populations have it among males, but it's much, much smaller in females. So this is not because it's sex-limited, right? So this is not because individuals with the genotype don't express if they're female, don't have the phenotype if they're female. Instead, what it is just the rareness of having 2 mutant copies. Right? So if we're talking about an X-linked trait, if it's an X-linked recessive, then that means a male need only inherit, males only have one X allele. So if males inherit a mutant copy, the male will definitely be affected. Whereas in females, 2 copies, sort of 2 bits of bad luck, are necessary to express the genotype. And so this is why it's more common for males to carry only mutant alleles for this trait than it is for females. Okay, so let's see if we can come up with a rule for this. So in this case, an affected male would be X star Y. Now we know again that X has been inherited from the mother. And so we can ask, is this mother affected? Okay, so in the sex-linked case, we said that no, because in the sex-limited case, we said no because it's sex-limited, so we don't see the phenotype in females. But in this case, we don't know, actually. We need to know about this other genotype. So this individual could either be affected or non-affected. So what that means is that males that are affected don't necessarily have an affected mother, Their mother usually is not affected if it's a rare trait, but could be affected. Okay, well, what about the other way around? What if we have an affected mother? Do we expect her offspring to be affected? Well, if the offspring is a male, then it's actually a fairly straightforward case. So for the mother, we know this mother must have 2 mutant alleles. We know that the offspring inherited a Y from the father, and so must have inherited one of these X's from the mother. And so now this individual has only one X, which is affected, so should be affected, or which is mutant, so should be affected. Okay, and so now we have our sort of whole suite of pedigree rules in X-linked recessive genes. That should say X-linked recessive. These are more common in males, and all sons of affected mothers are affected. Okay, so thanks very much. I hope that was helpful.